Welcome back to the Elmore Leonard podcast. This is Judd. I'm here with Alex. Alex,
Hello.
It's good to see you. It's good to hear you.
Great to be back, Judd.
I'm really excited about what we get to talk about today, which is swag. This is what I think of when I think of Elmore. This is classic Elmore, but there's so many different kinds of Elmore, but we're going to dig into this book. I do want to say fairly early on in the podcast, if you are listening in the car with your 2-year-old who is expanding his or her vocabulary, there might be some language. So get ready, be prepared, consider this your warning. Before we dive in, I'm just curious, Alex, so you were not around when this book came out, is that correct?
No, this is about 10 years before I was born.
So when did you pick it up? When did you read it? And how quickly did you try to get your own room at a bungalow-shaped apartment building in suburban Detroit?
I mean, I could have gotten a room at the apartment building that it's based on. They're called the Somerset Apartments. I was just talking to Peter about it because the nickname around town, it was called Sin City in the 70s. It was all the young professionals were there partying.
I love it.
I never tried to emulate the two Stick or Frank, but I read this book when I was in college, I think in one sitting. Kind of blew my mind a little bit. I think it's extra interesting to me because it has no film adaptation as of yet, but nevertheless, it still is held in kind of the highest regard among his books, which I think is very cool. Like, it hasn't reached that extra level of audience from a film or TV adaptation, and yet the people who know that it really is among the best of his books.
Well, I know there are always rumblings, but just to be clear, there was an adaptation of Stick by noted auteur Burt Reynolds.
Yes, sequel.
The sequel to Swag. Featuring...
But it feels like a completely different book. The movie, however, is a bizarre... It's one of those bad movies where the more I talk about it, the more it's like, oh, yeah, I got to see this movie. It's like Burt Reynolds has no idea what's happening. He populates the screen with just machine guns. He's super stiff, even though he's the star and director of the movie. It doesn't show him off very well. And yet it's completely boring.
I think it can politely be described as a misfire. I do know from getting to read the Cooler Than Cool biography from our dear friend C.M. Chad Cushins. Elmore, he went into that adaptation with high hopes. He was disappointed in it. Burt Reynolds thought he did a great job. If he was still here, we'd ask him on the podcast, of course, to maybe show us what we're missing. But we will have a link to the trailer of Stick in the show notes here. It is worth watching for so many reasons. But
I think when we get to Stick, the book, we can deep dive into exactly what went wrong. But
we should. But the thing is, and I don't want to get too far off track, but I actually think Burt Reynolds could have been good as other characters in Elmore adaptations. I will make that case. When we talk about Stick and we talk about the adaptation, I will make that case. It didn't work out, but we're here to talk about Swag. So
I feel like he could have been Frank Ryan more effectively if he was doing the Swag adaptation.
It's too late for that, Alex.
I understand, yes, but
it's too late. He would have been great. Cocky. Let's talk about the book for a little while.
Sure.
I know we're going to get sidetracked, so let's just dive in. This is a short, tight thriller. It still jumps around a lot. It still is incredibly evocative, but compared to, and this was written in the late 70s. This came out in 1976, I think. And to me, it really is, it feels modern. It also feels like the 1970s. It is the story of Frank Ryan and Ernest Stickley Jr., better known as Stick, as they become incredibly successful armed robbers. They meet when Frank is working as a car salesman on a used car lot, which is the perfect job for him. He catches Stick driving off. They have a conversation. There's not a physical confrontation. He lets him go, but he calls the cops. And
Frank even says he doesn't care about the car. He just doesn't want this guy to pull one over on him.
But yet he decides, hey, there's something about Stick that he feels comfortable with, and maybe he wants to work with this guy. He does go down to the jail to identify him, but when it's time for trial, Frank says he can't remember. He doesn't know for sure. I don't know if he uses the exact words reasonable doubt, but he does pretty much tank the case for the great state of Michigan.
So Stick's out. They decide to, or Frank decides this might be the guy that I've been looking for to start my armed robbery ring. They go hit some bars, and they end up at a place called the Bazooki, which is still a location in Greektown, Detroit. For the longest time, it has been a strip club.
Oh.
I've always known it as a strip club. And I was kind of curious about it because reading this book, every time I was like, it's funny that they go to this strip club, but there's no mention of that at all. So I did some research, and it looks like it was originally kind of like a belly dancing place. Like that's as far as it went. And then sometime, I'm guessing after 1976, they converted into a full strip club.
Oh.
It is one of the places that you can still go if you want to. The Elmore Leonard.
This will be on the guided tour that Alex gives every Thanksgiving at 8 a.m. Meet at Bazooki's, and
we'll get a ouzo. I think that's what they drink.
Get some ouzo, head over to the Renson. It'll be awesome. Okay, so but not just anyone can join Frank's gang. Frank is not just a typical armed robber. He has rules. He has 10 rules, in fact. All right, real quick. There's a series of cocktail bar napkins that these 10 rules are written on. Elmore's 10 rules actually got published, so he's one up on Frank here. Okay, number 1, always be polite on the job. Say please and thank you. Number 2, never say more than is necessary. That is a rule that I should follow. Number 3, never call your partner by name unless you use a made-up name. Number 4, dress well. Never look suspicious or like a bum. Number 5, never use your own car. Details to come. Never count the take in the car. Never flash money in a bar or with women. Never go back to an old bar or hang out once you have moved up. Never tell anyone your business. Never tell a junkie, even your name. Never associate, this is number 10, never associate with people known to be in crime.
I mean, Frank might be violating rule number 10 just by recruiting Stick.
From the beginning, it becomes very clear that Frank isn't paying as close attention to the rules as Stick does. So they decide to give it a shot. The first thing, though, that they're going to do is not steal any money, is not steal any jewelry. No, this is armed robbery that they're into. So they got to go steal some guns. And that's the only caper we see for a good chunk of the book, because they make off with the guns. They take one gun apiece, just one gun apiece. As far as armed robbers go, they're fairly conscientious. And then we jump ahead until they've already done about 25 successful armed robberies.
They've got a box of cash. They have their own apartment now. They're kind of living it up.
For me, what was so great about jumping ahead is we still have all the tension when things do start to go down. There's all this tension of how is this going to work? What's going to happen? It may have become routine for them, but it's not for us. And so that is really cool, because we don't know exactly how they've done it, but we know that it's working out. They've got money in the bank. They've got a cool apartment. Now, they're roommates, which I think is unique as far as, I don't know, Alex, if you've ever been roommates with anyone you've robbed liquor stores with, but that was curious to me. They have some arguments along the way. They share an apartment. They share a car. They're kind of a couple, and this is very much it's not a buddy cop story, but it's a buddy crook story, and their relationship and how it comes together and falls apart is really the central, the driving story.
I think you can see the similarities, or how they, in many ways they're similar, but in some key important areas they're quite different. And you can see the fissures starting pretty early in the book. Throughout the book, it's usually Frank who's the source of the problems here.
Oh, he's the source of all the problems. I mean, if it wasn't for Frank, we hear this from Stick. We learn this from Stick. Stick, he could get work anytime he needs to pouring cement down in Florida, where his daughter lives, who he never goes to see, thanks to Frank.
I feel like the meat of the book now is once they've set up their operation, and it's just kind of them hanging out, picking up girls, having parties, doing the occasional robbery.
Yeah, and you really understand what makes these guys tick. Frank is always interested, like you said at the beginning, Alex, Frank is always interested in not letting someone take advantage of him or taking advantage of somebody else. Stick is not driven like that. Stick seems to take a much more workmanlike approach to it, and that eventually it cracks right open. But in the meantime, we've got cigarettes, we've got booze, we've got pool parties.
We've got salty dogs, the drink that they mention half a dozen times.
Plenty of salty dogs. We've got record players. We've got Mantovani. We've got it all. This is the very R-rated version of Three's Company, is what this is. I wouldn't call it free love exactly. It's the 70s, not the 60s, but these are young, modern, professional people having a good time, getting to know each other. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead. I mean, I think there's really only one correct choice for our favorite line in the book. But we do, very early on, there are some gems that come up. So we'll save it. We'll get in there. But these guys, they're living the dream. And one last thing I'll say about skipping so many of those early robberies is because we get the full picture of who they are, who the players are.
I mean, they give us kind of a, best of, though. They say, like, here's the best take we had. Here's a guy who, no matter what we did, we threatened his wife, he would, he'd only give us $37. They kind of give you the cliff notes of, here's how our robbery spree has gone.
No, you definitely get some of the color of the road they've been on and some of the sense of why they're starting to get a little tired of things. They're living the dream at Sin City. There are several women that they're each attracted to in their own way. There's Mona, who is they share a wall with, and Mona's a call girl and takes her work home with her a lot, and they get a kick out of listening to her and are fascinated by it because she does not sound like she looks. So there's some real intrigue there. There's Karen. There's Arlene, who does some modeling for car shows and appears to be a kept woman. At first, as these guys are having parties, they don't really get too close, but at a certain point, human nature takes over, and Stick spends the night with beautiful Arlene.
I love the relationship, too. There's something that feels so realistic about it, where he says something like, oh, I never noticed her. I never paid her much attention, but she's actually very attractive. It seems like, this realistic thing of the more I got to know somebody, the more I spent time with them, my opinion of them has fully changed. It feels very natural.
Yeah, and I think it was also, they talk about how she seems to have a boyfriend who comes over a couple nights a week, and so maybe they assume she's taken or wouldn't be interested, but as they do get to spend time with her, as they do get to know her, sparks fly between Arlene and Stick. They spend the night together, and they get to hear Mona. Arlene stays over. They get to hear Mona working away next door, and Arlene she can't say what Mona is saying. We don't actually ever hear what Mona is saying. They move on. Their night is over. They part as friends, maybe more, maybe less. We don't really know.
Sometime later, Frank and Stick are at a bar in Hazel Park, which is right outside Detroit, near the old racetrack. And they eye a suspicious guy. They don't know if he's a cop or somebody sketchy.
The armed robbers see someone who looks suspicious.
Exactly, yes. But it turns out he is a hold-up man who steals the money of all the patrons in the bar and the money from the till. And right as he's about to walk out, Frank and Stick decide to hold up the hold-up man and take all the money that he has just stolen from the people. So they tie him up, put him in the storeroom with all the people in the bar, and lock the door, and leave with all the cash.
It is one of the funnier moments in the book, full of really, really funny moments. Subsequently, Stick does spend the night with Mona, and Stick figures out that he'd rather be with Arlene. He comes back. Stick comes home, and there's someone in the apartment in their underwear who's not Frank. And we meet Marlise. Marlise is young. She's beautiful. Stick might be a little uncomfortable. He's a little unsure. She's made herself at home. She's clearly spent the night there with Frank. They had a good time. She's making him some kind of a Bloody Mary concoction to sober up. And Stick is interested. Stick is excited until we learn how Frank knows Marlies. Marlies happens to know Sportree, who we meet very early on in the book, and he is who sets up Frank and Stick with the house to rob to get their guns. So already multiple times we've gone over Frank's 10 rules. Just right here, we're returning to a scene of a crime. We're associating with known criminals. There's 3 or 4. Stick is pissed. He is not happy about this. And there will be a reason why they're hooking up, but we don't find out right away. They've still got work to do, and they end up having probably what is their closest call in terms of an armed robbery.
They narrowly escape. There's a police chase. Stick keeps calm, gets them out of it, but is pretty pissed off afterwards.
Stick is furious, and Stick wants to just call it quits.
It becomes clear that Frank seems to kind of get off on the thrill of it, and Stick does not.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the difference is because Stick references his daughter that he misses. He has kind of more to live for than just the thrill of parties and narrowly escaping the police.
Right.
He also has a rap sheet. I think life would be a lot harder for him if they get caught.
He is definitely taking this a lot more seriously than Frank is. And Frank sort of deflects a little bit because this is when he really starts talking about this big job. It's going to involve other people, and maybe Stick is ready for it, maybe not. He doesn't know. And Stick is just annoyed, and he's irritated, and this is not the right time to hear about any big capers. They've just almost been arrested. Stick just isn't interested. So he has the grocery bag full of cash. There's not that much money in it, but it's a few $1,000s, and he starts to walk off. They've got to get a new car. And so because Stick he's the guy who steals the cars, he goes to steal another car for them to get home with. The last car they were driving in, the cops recognize, and so they can't use that again. So they've got the money from the grocery store. Stick is walking through a parking lot trying to find another car. Pretty quickly, he notices that he's being followed. He realizes he's being followed by not just one person, but 2. And he's been robbing people for a while now. He knows what to look out for. He knows what to recognize. He tries to get out, but he can't. These guys confront him. They take the money at first, but Stick is able to get his gun out, and he kills them. He shoots them both. And he's really torn by this. This was not what he wanted to do. This was not intentional.
And it's a rare case where I feel like Stick is frequently operating under kind of strict reason. And Frank operates more on impulse. This is a time where Stick has to use his impulse to kind of take care of these 2 guys who are robbing him. And it is the big turning point in the book. It feels like it gets darker. The kind of freewheeling aspect of it is now in question.
25, 26 robberies in, it's gotten very real and a lot more dangerous than when we started.
You would think it would have more psychological effects on the guys, but they pivot immediately into having the biggest party that they've thrown yet.
Well, but I think that's a reaction to this, because in a lot of ways the tables have really turned. Frank initially was in charge. He was initially the boss. But now that Stick has killed people, Stick is in charge of this dynamic. So maybe Frank needs to tell Stick that, hey, I'm not impacted by this. I'm not impressed so much by this. We're just going to have a good time. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to keep being Frank. And they have a big party. And they start inviting people over, and things get a little crazy. The craziest is Stick and Arlene head back to Arlene's place, and they're chatting, they're relaxing, they're having a good time, and Arlene lets it slip. And this
is also, you're skipping over the they run out of booze at the party, so they go and rob a liquor store, which is just one of the funniest.
This is such a great party that they run out of booze and have to go steal more booze, and while they're at it, a few more things. But this is only now, on the one hand, this makes sense, but they break a bunch of rules here, including taking Frank's car to rob this liquor store. They get away with it, but we're getting closer and closer to the time where Stick is really ready to just get out of there. And I think he might have, but he goes back to the party. He finds Arlene. They start chatting. And he finds out that she was at the Hazel Park bar where he and Frank ripped off the would-be armed robber. She saw them there. Now, they've pretended this whole time they've been at this swinging 70s bachelor and bachelorette pad. They've pretended they were in sales. They were sales consultants. If you were a salesman having a down day or a down week, they'd send these guys in to go inspire them. They took the quote-unquote frank and earnest approach, which we hear a couple of times. Frank likes that line.
Which was actually the title for the book, was the Frank and Earnest method until very late. The publisher changed it to Swag.
I did not know that.
Actually, the name Swag was from an unproduced screenplay that Elmore had written. It was titled Swag, which I didn't know about till recently. I asked Elmore's biographer, Chad Cushins, about it, because I was like, what is this Swag script? I feel like I've heard of all of the projects that he's done. And so late in his life, Elmore would talk about it a lot. There was he would refer to it as the Hawksbill Gang, or I've seen it written as Hawkbill Gang. He had Michael Caine and Sean Connery on the hook to do a Spanish Civil War set heist film. So one of the titles for that at one point was Swag. But the financing fell through. They said to shoot it would cost too much money, and those guys moved on to other things. But for a while, that was like almost a sure thing that was going to happen. And the word swag was kind of old-timey. It was like an outdated, like, gangster term. So it makes sense because that was kind of where the Swag script was set, was like an older story. So I think it's cool because, people would still say swag meaning like swagger, but that is not where the book title comes from.
I did not know that.
I'm like trying to connect I was like, all right, I know this information, I know this. So let me see if the biographer can piece the middle of it. And he was like, oh, I'm glad you asked, of course.
Chad Cushins for another win. So
he loves talking Elmore, so it's always fun to chat.
Oh no, he's the best, and he's been on, and he's going to be on again. Okay, so we've got a problem. Stick knows that Arlene knows.
It kind of freaks him out when she reveals this, but at the same time, she gets a call. She has landed another job and it immediately packs her bags and leaves, and Stick is still stuck there kind of bewildered in her apartment.
He doesn't know what to do. He wants to trust her, and he does. She takes off. They decide, okay, well, we'll talk about this later. I don't know who she's going to tell on her modeling job, but he's got to figure out, does he say anything to Frank?
At the moment, he decides to not say anything. He says, it's just going to wind Frank up, and that's the last thing I need now.
He's going to keep it to himself. And this is Stick's state of mind as he goes with Frank to hear about this big opportunity at J.L. Hudson's department store in beautiful downtown Detroit.
This was, it's a 14-story, city block-sized, enormous old world department store.
Just to remind everybody, this is almost 50 years ago. So some people had credit cards, but most people, when they went shopping, they paid cash. Some people used checks, but for the most part, cash was what people used to pay for things. And
so they've got Marlise, who's an insider, gives them all this info. They realize if they go at this exact time, dressed as delivery drivers, that they can make off with all 14 floors worth of cash receipts for that day.
And they'll be dressed up somebody will be dressed up as a Brinks truck driver, and they will take the cash, as they often do, right before the actual Brinks truck drivers show up. So they've got a couple other people. So we've got Sportree, who is sort of masterminding this whole thing. He's not going to be there, but it's going to be Frank. It's going to be Billy Ruiz, a former boxer who went 17-17, and then he did 17 years in prison. So whatever you do, don't bring up the number 17.
And there's also Leon Woody, who has a connection to The Big Bounce, an Elmore book from 1969. The main character of that is named Jack Ryan, who we find out there's no relation to Frank Ryan. But Leon Woody is mentioned multiple times in The Big Bounce for doing B&Es with Jack Ryan. They would pose as kind of carpet cleaners or workmen, break into houses, steal all kinds of stuff, and fence it. And also, so that connection is a straight, we've heard about this guy from a previous Elmore book. The weirder one is Billy Ruiz is a name that's used in The Big Bounce, but it can't possibly be the same guy because this Billy Ruiz in Swag has been in prison for this whole time.
Was he a boxer in The Big Bounce?
I don't think so. It's never mentioned that he's a boxer.
Well,
must just be that Elmore liked the name or something. This is so early in the character connections that this is maybe the only instance of like, oh, that doesn't really line up. I feel like he usually has such a kind of concrete behind the scenes character map going.
Yeah.
Where like timelines line up, like, a prison stint would exactly line up with where one person would be. We don't get too much info on Billy Ruiz before he's out of the picture anymore.
Well, no, and spoiler alert, he does leave the picture, and at that point we do learn that he loves ice cream. It's in his obituary. But so the crew so Marlise is working there, so she'll be working there. Frank is going to be there. Billy Ruiz is going to be there dressed up in a Brinks outfit, and Leon Woody. And they are going to go time it right. Stick's job is to keep an eye on when the Brinks truck is coming, because the room where all the cash is, all the receipts are, they get a phone call basically saying that the truck is there and to be ready. So the timing is really important. So Stick is also paying attention to this. His job isn't really to do anything that day other than give them a heads up, and then a couple days later they're going to go back and pick up the cash because they're assuming that there's not going to be enough time to make the escape. So it's a huge building, and what they've worked out is they're going to take the box, they're going to take a box for a big doll and fill it up with cash and mark it and leave it in a storeroom, and then retrieve it because Marlise will have access and she can keep an eye on it. But Stick can go back and just sort of waltz in and take it from the stock room when it's safe in a couple days. Alas, this is not what happens, for a lot of reasons, but
multiple complications. One of which being a window washer. Yes, is watching the robbery go down.
They don't notice.
So he must be taken out. Yes, Billy Ruiz decides that window washer must die.
The window washer dies, not how he intended. We learned that he had a wife and family, this poor window washer, and Billy shoots him through the glass, and things start to go sideways. So they take the cash. Frank is paying attention. He notices that Leon and Marlise are paying a lot of attention to what's put in the box. He doesn't really clock it because he's just seen a man get killed. And as they're leaving, Leon shoots Billy in the back, and they just keep going. This seems like it's gone horribly wrong. Pretty soon cops are all over the place. They're not investigating a robbery. They're investigating a murder of two people, and they got to figure out what's going on. So Stick is still sitting on the information about Arlene. He hasn't really shared it with Frank. Frank doesn't really tell Stick everything about what happened.
Yeah, he doesn't come forward with the truth about shooting Billy Ruiz.
And then our world expands a little bit, and we know, we're not totally surprised, but we know before Frank and Stick know that Sportree and Leon and Marlise have their own plan happening, and they already have the cash, $87,000 in cash that they've already taken from the department store.
It is an interesting aspect. I mean, I think because this book is still Elmore refining his kind of signature style, which, is sometimes called free indirect discourse, which is when he has a chapter that's from a character's point of view, where all the descriptions are like what the character would think or say. He hasn't really solidified that style. He's definitely experimenting with it. It comes across more like the earlier, you see people talk about like Jane Austen writing this way, where like the narration will sometimes say a line that like clearly is what a character would say. And that's kind of what this is. Usually it's kind of from Stick's perspective. He's the main guy, it does, but it does switch where we're in a room where Stick and Frank aren't there, and it's Sportree and Leon Woody kind of talking.
Well, it's interesting because I think that this is there's I don't think there's anything tentative about this style. I think it's I think this is I think that later on he would make these switches more frequently. Within chapters, within paragraphs, even, or not within paragraphs, but much more frequently than here. And
I think he just makes it more obvious. I think it's when it's a character chapter, it's like until there's a big line break, he's in that guy's head. And here it's not so cut and dry. It's, some paragraphs will be slightly a different perspective, some won't. Some will almost be straight narration. I find it is great. I think it's one of those examples of like he's on to something. The book is incredibly well written, super tightly written, and I don't think it's any worse for not having his like 80s, 90s, 2000s style where it was all buttoned up. I actually find it more interesting because it's him onto something new.
I think it feels really tight, even when it expands. And we expand into not just Sportree and Leon, but also Cal and Emery, who Cal is the main cop and who we're going to meet soon, and Emery, who's one of the district attorneys for Wayne County in Detroit. So, but we know before Frank and Stick know what's happened. We know what's happened, and we also. This is sort of the fun part in the book where we now know more than everybody else. And a lot of the times, as a reader, we're playing catch up to what the characters know. But at this point, we've got Stick not telling Frank about Arlene, Frank not telling Stick the full story of Leon killing Billy Ruiz, and neither of them knowing that the money is already gone. And based on Leon shooting Billy, we don't expect Sportree and Leon to just let Frank and Stick be. But Stick goes back the day he's supposed to go, and he lets himself into the stockroom to get the doll box with what he thinks is the cash in it. He's met by our new friend Cal, a long-haired, hippie-looking Detroit detective. And Stick is arrested.
I do like, though, there's multiple mentions that the cops, even when they're plain clothes, they still look like cops.
Yeah. So Cal is sort of, he arrests a guy, but it's very clear very quickly, like, what exactly is Stick being arrested for? He walked into the stockroom. He picked up a box. As it turns out, there's nothing in the box that Stick wants. There's some checks, but there's no way to connect Stick with the robbery at first. Now, Cal wants to start digging, and he's working out with Emery how to go about doing this. And they have a few things to go on, which go back to the guns. The guns that kill Billy and the window washer were Frank and Stick's guns that they'd been using this whole time. And those were the guns that had been reported stolen many moons ago from our first robbery, when they ripped off the guns from the house that Sportree told them about. It sounds like those guns have been seen in a lot of armed robberies. Cal and Emery are on to something. They know that he and Frank have been taken advantage of by Sportree and Leon. But so now we have all of these characters who know something that none of the other characters do, and it's a lot to keep track of, but it's a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. Making this even more complicated is now Stick, who's always had a reason to leave town in terms of going and seeing his daughter. He's got a reason to stick around, and that's Arlene. He's got feelings. So Stick's in jail for a couple of days. Frank bails him out. Now, and there is some discussion of, and this is where Frank has to tell Sportree and Leon, hey, look, I know this guy because he's cool. I know this guy because he can handle pressure. I've seen him having to handle it. He's not going to say anything. He's not going to say anything. We can trust him. Sportree and Leon are not convinced.
And we don't know if because they already planned to rip these guys off, or if, that's most likely the case. But
right. Well, they've already taken the money, And they don't, and Frank doesn't know this. Frank is in the room with Leon and Sportree talking about, he's vouching for Stick, saying, you guys don't have to worry about him because this charge that the cops are going to bring against him, the judge is going to throw it out. What's the charge here? Stealing a box?
Yeah, exactly.
So they know that they've got some wiggle room here, but we know that Sportree and Leon are, they'll kill people if they have to, just like we know Stick will kill someone if he has to. So it's starting to get a lot more dangerous. So Stick gets out, and he and Frank go talk to Sportree, and in the middle of trying to figure out what went wrong, Sportree just admits that he's got the cash. He just tells him he's got the cash, and Marlise was able to take it, and we figured 2 chances at bringing the cash back are better than 1, and so we took advantage of it. And Stick and Frank's reaction is a little... It's interesting because they're not totally surprised. They also don't really overreact to learning that Sportree he's already ripped them off, and he just decides to let him in on it now. And now they have to sort out, how are we going to not just get our share of the robbery, but not get killed. And they know that they're going to have to put themselves into some sort of dangerous situation to even have a chance at getting the money.
But Stick he shows his smarts again. I think that plan hinges on if they want to go to another location and not take their car,
right,
then they're probably going to kill us. So
yeah, but they agree and they work it out. In the meantime, Stick is trying to figure out what to do, if anything, with Arlene, and she wants to go with him. He tells her he loves her, and they spend some more time together, and they're gonna make a run for it. They have a couple things they need to take care of. Inadvertently, Arlene she moves, but she leaves a forwarding address. So Cal, our friendly hippie police officer, is able to track her down and scares her a little bit in terms of what is happening, what could happen. Cal's also trying to convince the guys, hey, he comes and visits them at the pool, and he's talking to Frank, and Stick sees him, and he decides, I'm gonna go join this conversation, pretend that there's nothing strange here, even though Cal arrested Stick just a few days ago.
But it becomes apparent that the police kind of have nothing on them.
Yeah, so they realize that if they really had something that would, forgive the term, stick, they'd be arrested by now, and they haven't been. So there's something that they're still looking for. Whether or not they can find it before Stick and Frank can get at least some of the money that they stole. And, $87,000 in the 1970s, it's a lot of money now. It was really a lot of money back then. So they're just trying to get their share and get out of there. And so they're trying to figure out a plan. They know that they'll need to go to another location. And like you said, Stick is thinking ahead. Well, number one, goes and steals another gun, which the cops hear about, but they don't really do anything with. We don't actually know who has stolen the gun until we see that Stick has the gun with him, because it feels like a very desperate move to, in the middle of all this, for either Frank or Stick to break into this poor guy's house again and steal his, is it a Walter PPK? Stick brings it with him, and before he and Frank go in to see Sportree and Leon, he stashes it in Leon's car before they go in and meet Leon and Sportree, and they play along. They play along when Sportree and Leon tell them, hey, we'll all ride together. We'll go get the money. We'll split it up. We'll come back here. We'll have a drink. Then you get your car. No problem. And so that's what they do. They get to the hotel. I believe it's called the Motel Ritz. Was that a real location, Alex?
It was, yes. I was looking it up. It looks, it's long since demolished, but the photos of it are pretty bleak. I feel it's one of those places where I was like, yep, this seems like the the site of a deal gone wrong would go down.
Well, Spoiler alert, everybody. It does go wrong for Sportree and Leon.
It has some of, I think, the best description of the violence that Elmore has done yet, which I think he started back in the Western days where, he wouldn't get cute with it. It would just be so-and-so shot this person, or, the blood went blah, blah, blah. But in this one, it's like very dispassionately, Stick shoots these two guys. It's very highly effective.
We know Sportree has a gun. We're told Leon goes and gets a gun from the bathroom. They come out, but before anything can go down, Stick, who, when he was leaving the car, pretended that he dropped his cigarettes, that old chestnut, and grabbed the gun.
It's another scene that seems so visual. Like I could just see the movie version in my head, like it's hinging on him, reaching down, not quite grabbing the gun for a second. I'm sure it'll be a movie one day, but it just is so evocative.
It is a great moment. It is surprising, even though we have a sense that something is going down. We know how badly Stick is trying to do this. They don't have the money yet. The money was always back at Sportree, so they head back to Sportree's place. And Marlise is hanging out, and she thinks she's telling Sportree, hey, I'm here in the back. Frank and Stick are looking for the money. Frank finds it. Stick says, hey, we're taking off. Is it Stick or Frank who tells her?
It's another great line. Frank says, I think he'd want us to have it, talking about the money. And Marlise frowned at him, saying, what you talking about? And Frank says, you're going to find out anyway. He died. And you know something? You could too. That's the end of the section.
It's great. Is the end of the romance of Frank and Marlise. They take off. And what's Marlise going to say? Because she was up to her neck in it. And
she's in on it,
So now we've got Frank, we've got Stick, we've got Arlene. We've got to get out of town. How are we going to do this? This is tough. Arlene, Stick trusts her enough to give her the money. They know, Frank and Stick know that. Now, this is kind of interesting. There's no big scene where Cal and Emery find the bodies. Oh, let's go find Sportree, and where's Sportree? And we never actually know whether or not Cal knows that they've been killed. We just know that they're following them, and Frank and Stick are expecting to get pulled over, get searched, so they can't have the money on them. So they have to trust Arlene.
It is in keeping with, he's kind of a bad cop.
Cal.
And the end, Cal is he does poor police work, and even in the end, their big thing is just to stop them and search them again. They have no real new evidence, no reason to suspect really that, they're going to bust them.
Yeah, they don't really know what they're looking for, but they're going to give it a shot and try something. They don't find any money. They do find some Delta tickets. They're planning on flying Delta down to Florida, but there's also a note. The note stands out because it's not from Delta Airlines, it's from American Airlines, and this is considered product placement, so send us all kinds of frequent flyer miles for mentioning you on our podcast. But there's a note from Arlene to Stick, and it just says, I'm sorry. And with the note, there's a key.
Yes, the locker key, which I always liked because it feels like a connection to Get Shorty, where a huge part of that plot is the locker key that the police are endlessly staking out.
They're hanging out at the airport day after day, week after week. In swag, the cops actually get to open it up, and they find the money. And
Arlene has flown to California. She mentions a couple times her friend in Bakersfield, and it seems like my band has played there. We played in Bakersfield. It's an interesting place. It was memorable for me to play there, weirdly, because we played at a brewery, and there was 3 security guards, for our sparsely attended show. And the security guards it was almost like a cartoon. It was like the tall, skinny one, the short one, and the fat one. And they would all walk in kind of a row.
Oh, that's awesome.
And be like patrolling behind the stage. That was great.
Did you steal any beer?
No, I mean, I don't know. You've been to these kind of breweries. They gave us unlimited beer, and it's just like, I don't want this one tastes like celery. It's like that kind of thing. Just like unlimited bad beer. Like, thanks, but no thanks.
Well, hopefully you have another place to play in Bakersfield.
We'll go back. We love it there.
So that's where Arlene went. And maybe Arlene will be at your next show in Bakersfield. But Arlene is gone. And she leaves the money. She leaves Stick. She breaks his heart. And she gets Stick and Frank arrested. It is surprising they don't get away with it, but it's also inevitable that they don't get away with it. It's a perfect ending, and it leads to the best line in the book. I mean, there are some. I like that. There are some contenders.
We didn't even have to talk about it, and I knew what you were referring to, though. That's great.
If you've read the book, you know. There are others that I think are honorable mentions. There's a bunch of good ones. Alex, you want to mention any?
Oh yeah, I love the one when they pay for the apartment, and they said they're going on a vacation, and the manager says, "Oh, I would have thought you got enough rest sitting around the pool every day." And Frank says, "Sitting, yes. But they were always thinking, and thinking was hard work." I was like, okay, that's great.
It is, but not as great as the last line. Alex, I'd like you to have the honors.
It's the last line of the book. It seems to sum up how the partnership is going.
As they're being walked off, caught red-handed by the state police, Cal, they're done for.
Frank says, "What do you think I went to the trouble to think up all those rules for? You remember the 10 rules? We act like businessmen and nobody knows our business. You remember that?" And the final line, Stick says, "Frank, why don't you shut the fuck up?"
It's perfect. This is a perfect book. There's so many other great books that he's written, but this is a perfect book. There's other perfect books he's written.
This one, I feel like nobody else could have written it. It, like, for the era it is, like, to write this completely unconventional, just original crime story. Like, there's still nothing like it. I feel like the kind of tangents into the apartment life are so funny, and every part of it's great. The robberies are great. It's been often copied. The dialogue's great. The writing is incredible. It really is a hell of a book.
It's fantastic. And so much of it feels, particularly when they're talking, when we're hearing about the robberies or seeing the robberies take place, some of them feel like they would have been stories that Elmore would have gotten from real cops. Particularly the one in the bar, and I don't know. I mean, he spent a lot of time obviously with cops, and if you haven't read Impressions of Murder, which is a great piece Elmore wrote in the '80s, following around
it's so good
homicide detectives in Detroit, you got to read it. But that story in particular just jumped out as this is somebody who is. I mean, it's a combination of a great imagination, but also having a great ear and talking to the people who are living this life.
I did get another bit of insight from Chad Cushion's Elmore biographer.
You're killing me.
So basically, no, this is good. Basically, so Elmore was married to my grandmother for about 27 years. And right around this time, the marriage had dissolved. He was with his not yet second wife, Joan, for a couple of years, but she was still married and had to get divorced. And in the meantime, he got an apartment in an apartment building, not the one that we were calling Sin City, but he was on his own in an apartment building in Birmingham, Michigan, when he wrote this book. So I asked Chad, I was like, I know he lived on his own for a little bit, but would it have been when he was writing this? And Chad said, it lines up. Like, the apartment antics, or some of it, would definitely have been pulled from his real life. Just the descriptions of how the people are behaving, or, Yeah. So I thought that was, and apparently Agent Swanson, Elmore's agent, sent him a letter that said, like, "Now get back to work, you bachelor," just kind of ribbing him.
That's awesome.
So I was like, oh, that's great. Because it is so different. Like, all the stuff at the apartment is so different. It's like, he's living a different life for the first time in 27 years. Like, and he pulls all of that and puts it into the book.
That's amazing.
One other thing I want to point out is, I talked in the Rum Punch episode about Max Cherry being kind of an Elmore stand-in. Yeah. This one, it's clearly Stick, because it even says Stick's birthday, which was Elmore's birthday, October 11th. And Stick growing up in Oklahoma, Elmore, when he was really young, spent some time in Oklahoma. His family lived there briefly. Also the daughter. Stick's got a daughter who would have been the same age as my Aunt Katie.
Oh. Here's something I want to ask you after reading about 4 pages of this book. Did Elmore swear a lot in real life?
No.
Were you allowed to swear around him? Even though you knew what was in the books, did you feel funny swearing around him? Would you?
probably just as like a, authority figures, respect kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I was going to his readings when I was, 10, 12 years old, and he would read a chapter from his book and would be saying all the dialogue. So it was kind of funny to hear me, my grandfather say this stuff, but that's what the characters are saying.
Right.
He wasn't like that.
Yeah.
I've got one other thing. I don't know if you caught the connection since we just read Rum Punch. Simone, when she's talking about being from Detroit, and she told him all the places that she would hang out, Sport Trees was on the list.
I did not catch that. That is a great connection. But also, isn't that where Ordell and Lewis would hang out?
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll have to read The Switch again. I feel like every time I read one of these things, there's a small little mention of a place. Sport Trees itself is kind of cool because it's a name of a real jazz club that Elmore would go to that was in the Paradise Valley, kind of the black entertainment district of Detroit, that like Black Bottom, like those kind of places that were just demolished to build the interstate.
Oh,
so he chose the name of a real place.
Depressing.
Yeah, I know, but it's always, he chose the name of a real place to populate his characters or locations.
I just looked it up. Simone mentioned Sport Tree, but we learned in Rum Punch that Lewis and Ordell would hang out at the Watts Club, not at Sport Trees, but
which was a real club, which then I was talking about Bazooki transitioning to a strip club. I believe the Watts Club was a standard bar that then transitioned into a male strip club. There's a YouTube video advertisement from I think it's from the 80s for Watts Club Mozambique, and it introduced all the different crews of guys.
Okay, this will definitely be in the show notes.
That you could go see.
This will definitely be in the show notes.
It's pretty funny. I mean, it was that was a real place. Oh, I did also. Did you notice the phrase "be cool" was said numerous times?
I did notice that. Yeah.
I clocked it 6 times.
I did not clock it that many times.
I'm kind of curious now how many other books he says it before the book "Be Cool." I always like the repeated phrases or things that are kind of swirling around his head that you see in and out.
Yeah.
So.
I hadn't read this in a while, and it still jumps off the page. I know when we talked about Rum Punch, I love it, but I didn't think it was quite top shelf Elmore. I think this is. I think if you're going to narrow down from all the novels, the 40 plus novels, I think Swag has to be on that best of shelf. I think 1,000% it has to be there.
We do disagree a little. I think Rum Punch is right up there. I do prefer. I think Swag is perhaps the top one, or for me it's in the top 3. So I love this book.
Well, let's save the others for future episodes. I want to hear those, but we're going to start building out.
Well, it can change too. I think rereading them frequently, you find new things to like. So.
No, for sure. I mean, as perspective changes, the lens shifts, and yeah, we look at it differently. So, Alex, these books as well as anybody. Came out in '76. Mm-hmm. This is relatively early on. He may have still been working in advertising when this happened. When this book came out. This might have
been the freelance era where he wrote some Britannica scripts for kind of documentary stuff. Like the history of
Encyclopedia
Rome.
Britannica.
Yeah, the history of Rome or something, and he would write kind of like a boilerplate script.
Okay, so but this is, even though we look at Swag now as one of the classic Elmore Leonard novels.
But this is very early in his crime career. He did a hard pivot with The Big Bounce in '69, and he did 52 Pickup. But between those, he'd written Mr. Majestic and 40 Lashes Less One. Mr. Majestic is kind of more modern crime stuff, but still not, his style hadn't been solidified. With Swag and Unknown Man Number 89, he really stuck his ground in the crime and usually Detroit crime genres. Yeah, as you pointed out, Judd, the influence of the Friends of Eddie Coyle seems very apparent to me. Maybe stronger in 52 Pickup, but yeah, he's writing modern books with characters who sound modern, locations that are current. And especially in Swag, he's writing a book that nobody else has written. They're very unique crime novels. I always find it funny, they're written in the praise. It says a great caper. Well, yeah, there is like a robbery, but Stick is the main character and he's not even involved in it. Like they're very unconventional books, still realistic and kind of gritty in their way, but they're truly unique.
But we talked a little bit earlier about Elmore finding his style, and on the one hand, I don't think there's anything half-baked about this book, but on the other hand, I do see what you're talking about. What was it that you think was most interesting to him about this book?
I think he found what he was always looking for was characters who could talk or who were fun, and this book is loaded with them. Even guys like Frank, who are a bit of a jerk, he has some funny lines. Leon Woody's got good lines. Sportree does. Stick has a ton. Arlene, everybody's got, like, this is really...
Marlise has great lines.
Overloaded with characters who could talk. And that usually is the sign of a great Elmore novel, is if the people can talk.
Do you think he was doing anything differently in terms of his approach to writing? Was he writing, was it more notes? Was it less notes? Was he just kind of following the characters more, which is something that...
I think that's the big thing. He's following the characters more. This, to me, is also he's going out into kind of undiscovered territory. 52 Pickup, I think, is a great book, but it's more of a kind of gritty crime novel. There's blackmail and revenge. This book, for a lot of, a big portion of it, it's, okay, two bachelors hanging out having parties. It has unconventional parts. It's a kind of a miracle that the crime stuff and the murder is just as engaging as hanging out by the pool. But I think that's one of the great strengths of the book.
No, it is. I mean, we talked about it a little bit where there's a point where the things that are the most gripping have nothing to do with armed robberies. I mean, they're related to them. Arlene finding out, that's a huge moment. And it's not one that's fully resolved, and it kind of drives a lot of the tension through the rest of takes us through the rest of the story. It's really great. Talk a little bit about, if you can, so Friends of Eddie Coyle was written by George V. Higgins. I know that part of the reason why Elmore decided he wanted his archives at the University of South Carolina was because George V. Higgins has a lot of stuff there, in addition to Hemingway and Fitzgerald and other great writers. But maybe just talk a little bit about George V. Higgins.
Yeah, that book was kind of a game changer for Elmore. It uses dialogue the way that Elmore would use dialogue, where there's so much characterization without a lot of words getting in the way of these people talking. And it kind of strips the author out of the equation. It allows the characters to say and act and have attitude in a way that I think Elmore felt kind of slowed down by. So reading a book that was written in this style was it like enlightening to him. He was doing elements of it before reading Friends of Eddie Coyle, but I think it just gave him free license to do whatever he wanted. Yeah. So, like, nobody would say was copying the style. That's not really it, but finding inspiration from it for sure.
He's talked about it a fair amount, and it does. As I was reading it, I was, certainly thinking of that book a little bit. I don't know that book well at all.
One thing is funny about it is the main character's name. Do you remember of Friends? There's Eddie Coyle, but then the other guy, the gun runner, his name is Jackie Brown.
Well, there you go.
Yep. Which, not an Elmore name. If you haven't listened to our Rum Punch episode, her name is Jackie Burke, but it is still funny that completely formative crime novel name has been used a couple times.
Well, it sounds like Quentin was paying double tribute with his movie. You mentioned a minute ago that he was doing work for Encyclopedia Britannica. So even though he is publishing novels regularly just about every year and getting good reviews, writing books still isn't his full-time career when Swag comes out.
The book came out, Elmore's had some film success with his Westerns and then like Paul Newman's Hombre, but the book sales weren't, crazy at this point. He had good reviews. The New York Times was favorably reviewing him, but he still, for the rest of the decade, was kind of grinding it out. Throughout the 70s, he had major kind of critical acclaim that didn't really translate into book sales.
Yeah.
But he kept kind of piling on, every book would be reviewed well over and over and over again. And that by the 80s, I think La Brava won the Edgar Award. And then he had Glitz was his first #1 bestseller.
Right.
That was well into the 80s. But I think it's one of those things where he really kind of staked his ground, and Swag, to me, is the big turning point that makes him impossible to ignore.
And do you think this is also where he's looking at it and maybe thinking like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like this is what confirms it, not just maybe for the reviewers, but for himself.
Yes. And he went back, he wrote a couple more, I know, and I think it was 78 or 90, he wrote Gun Sights, which is a Western, but Gun Sights is a great book too. It uses a lot of the lessons that he learned from his crime writing. It uses his more modern style. So that's almost a hybrid. And right before these, I mentioned 40 Lashes Less One is a Western, but one of the most unconventional Westerns. It's really funny and weird and kind of, takes place at this prison and, with these kind of goofy prison wardens and the like weird antics they get up to. That book is incredible. And I always am fascinated by those kind of the hybrid ones where he's really, really experimenting because I think Hombre is probably my favorite of his Westerns, and that's really kind of straightforward. But then the ones where he's doing the mix, like the hybrid style, more like Valdez is Coming and 40 Lashes are super entertaining and just different in their own way.
Swag definitely stands out.
Swag seems to be like, for people who know Elmore's books, kind of a unanimous favorite.
It's tough to argue. I think there's so many great ones, and that's why we're here doing this podcast, is to talk about all of them eventually. But Swag is definitely one of the best.
So I always say everyone has their own favorite of Elmore Leonard novels, but Swag might be unique in that it's always in the conversation.
As it should be. As it should be. It's a perfect book. It is a perfect book. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We will be back with you again very soon on the Elmore Leonard podcast. Alex, take it easy.
Judd, why don't you shut the fuck up?